Therefore, less signaling for these platelets and coagulation factors to go to that site of the endothelial damage and then create a clot or a thrombosis. Doesn't really make sense to me. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about added sugars and more specifically erythritol. If you've been aware, over the past week or so there was a new bombshell study that came out. It's all over the news that is talking about how erythritol has been linked to cardiovascular disease, blood clotting, and some very serious health effects. So we're going to be going over what this study actually was saying. We're going to be talking about if the claims made by the news are accurate and how dangerous is erythritol really. And we're going to be looking at it from both angles of study design, interpreting the data of the study, and also from a practical standpoint, what this means for you if you're looking out for erythritol in your diet, and if that's going to really play a big benefit by eliminating it in terms of decreasing your risk for cardiovascular disease and things of that nature. So just to begin, erythritol is an added sugar. It is it's an artificial sweetener rather, and it is found naturally in some foods like grapes, watermelon, and some fermented foods like some cheeses, beer, wine, things of that nature. But in general, erythritol is an artificial sugar. And the reason why it's gained so much popularity over the past few years at this point, say about 3 or 4 years, is that it contains no calories. So for its sweetness profile, it is an additive as a sugar replacement. So it is a sugar alcohol, and these do not get digested by the body, or at least that's the theory behind using erythritol. Because it's not digested, it can't play into any calorie intake, right? It's just going to pass through our whole system without giving us any calories, but will still give us the sweetness as a sugar replacement. So that's erythritol. And this study, what it examined was an association between erythritol and erythritol in the blood, more specifically, not necessarily digested erythritol, which we'll get into in a second, but it measured the association between erythritol levels in the blood and your risk for cardiovascular disease via blood clotting mechanisms. So we're going to be going over this study. So we're going to be going over the study that was published in Nature Medicine, or nature.com here. And this was published again a little over a week ago now, February 27th, 2023. And again, title of the article here, it is The Artificial Sweetener Erythritol and Cardiovascular Event Risk. So let's take a look as to what this study was trying to suggest. So reading a scientific article, everything starts with an abstract, which is essentially just an overview of the entire paper. So we'll just touch a little bit onto this, see what their main findings were, and then we'll dive deeper into each of the sections. So this paper specifically looked at the risk for major adverse cardiovascular events, aka the MACE, so MACE, which includes death or non-fatal myocardial infarction or stroke. So major cardiovascular events that would cause death or non-fatal otherwise. So things like blood clotting, thrombosis, any sort of coagulation in the blood. This is what this study was trying to link to erythritol use, or rather its serum concentration in the blood. So this study was conducted using targeted metabolomics analysis in independent US and European validation cohorts. And what they found was that at physiologic levels, erythritol enhanced platelet reactivity in vitro and thrombosis formation in vivo. So what does this mean? This means that in the presence of erythritol, there was enhanced platelet activity, which are the factors that would induce a thrombotic or blood clotting event. So the little platelets would be the things that would stick to the endothelium. And again, the endothelium is just the inner lining of a blood vessel. So every sort of major cardiovascular event always starts at the endothelium. So any sort of damage to the endothelium is going to bring in these platelets and other factors as well to create a little clot so that it can heal that endothelium. Now, this is a good thing in normal bodily processes because whenever there is bleeding, right, if you cut yourself and a vein pops or gets cut and slit and there's blood rushing out, you want those clotting factors to be there so you can repair the endothelium and keep the blood inside of you. So this is important. Where it gets to be a problem is when you have so many of these clots when there isn't a necessity for endothelial clotting factors to be there in the first place. So if you have excessive cholesterol levels and there are always these sort of predisposed clotting factors circulating in the blood and they're particularly sticky, these will create these little plaques on the endothelium all over your body, which can turn into full-on thrombosis or thrombotic blood clots. And this is in reaction to no endothelial damage or just an increase of this blood pressure and stress that's placed on the endothelium when there shouldn't be. So these are things that we can directly prevent, but specifically for this study, they were just evaluating the erythritol concentration in that blood specifically and what the relation was to platelet activity, platelet reactivity, and thrombosis formation. And moving on, we see that this paper says, finally, in a prospective pilot intervention study, erythritol ingestion in healthy volunteers, N equals 8, which is very important to note because that is a very small sample size. So N equals 8 means that there was only 8 people being used in that particular study. So very small study size, which is already indicative of a poorly designed study. So that's going to be something we'll touch upon a little bit later, but keep that in mind. Very small sample size. And that's not typically very indicative of accurate results, right? A lot of errors can be found in just 8 people. And what they found was that it induced marked and sustained decreases in plasma erythritol levels, well above thresholds associated with heightened platelet reactivity and thrombosis potential in vitro and in vivo studies. Our findings reveal that erythritol is associated with incident MACE risk, or as we had mentioned before, the cardiovascular disease risk or event, and fosters enhanced thrombosis. Studies assessing the long-term safety of erythritol are warranted. So from reading the abstract, it seems like this is a major finding. This is something that we should all be worried about. Increased erythritol levels is associated with some serious thrombotic events, which is very eye-catching, very, and like they said, warranted for assessing the long-term safety of using erythritol as a sugar substitute. But is this something that we should really be worried about? Let's go into the paper and see if the abstract sort of masked what they actually did in their study. So skipping down here, we're just at the main part of the article, at least the section that they named main, which is a little bit odd, but nevertheless. They go into talking about erythritol a little bit, and they say that little is known about the long-term effects of artificial sweeteners, and with the correct assumption, that is what they will be looking to evaluate. So patients with metabolic diseases, including type 2 diabetes and obesity, are frequently advised that the use of artificial sweeteners in place of sugar can improve glycemic control and help weight loss. Why is this? This is because people with type 2 diabetes are heavily insulin resistant to the point that now they have passed that insulin resistance and they're already full-blown type 2 diabetes. So whenever they spike up blood glucose levels, again, from sugar is glucose. When you have an increase of glucose that you ingest, this is going to spike up blood glucose levels. Insulin is being produced at such a great amount over a long period of time that the body is not reacting to that insulin, and it can't shovel all that blood glucose into the target tissue. So the glucose is in the blood, and it can't get into your muscles, into your liver, into the fat cells, into your brain, wherever it is. Insulin is not inducing the right effects, and rather the body's not actually reacting to that insulin spike in the blood. So that's type 2 diabetes. Obesity is pretty much working in a similar mechanism in the way that it's specifically targeting the fat cells. So what we'll see specifically for glucose intake is that people who are heavily insulin resistant are going to be typically more obese, just for the fact that the insulin is targeting the fat cells to induce hypertrophy, and it's actually becoming very leaky with all the fat that's in those cells because it's grown so big. So that's just the way insulin works at the fat cells. And again, it's going to be due to high amounts of blood sugar, so glucose or sugars in the blood over a long period of time. This is how you become insulin resistant, or at least exaggerate those mediated effects. So while using erythritol, what this is going to do is, at least in theory, and we'll talk about this more now, is that it's going to take the place of sugar. And again, it's not a part of the metabolic processes like glycolysis, the breakdown of those sugars so that we can put it in our body. And so we don't actually digest those calories within our bodies. So that's going to directly reduce your insulin levels that are spiked in the blood, subsequently lessening the burden on the fat cells, reducing your type 2 diabetes symptoms. At least if you're already full-blown type 2 diabetes, it might even have the potential to completely reverse it, but that's, again, long standing. So that's what erythritol is aimed to do. And the paper here does note that there are at least 3 studies that would support that fact. Scrolling down a little bit more, randomized clinical trials examining the long-term safety of consuming artificial sweeteners have not been performed, even for more early adopted forms such as aspartame and sucralose. Indeed, despite the growing incorporation of artificial sweeteners in the food chain, their cardiovascular risks have seldom been investigated. I assume that's what they will be doing here. Third paragraph just talks about what erythritol is. Okay, so now the fourth paragraph in that main section, it says that nevertheless, little is known about circulating erythritol levels and cardiometabolic risks. Now, this is important to note because circulating erythritol levels is not directly linked to the amount of erythritol that you eat. And why is this? And the study failed to mention this for the most part. They might have masked it a little bit. But when we metabolize the food in our body, specifically glucose undergoing glycolysis, the body is going to naturally make erythritol. It's a part of the pentose phosphate pathway. So there's a main section of digestion, or your metabolism. When you're breaking down glucose as a part of glycolysis, there's a side pathway that energy might get shunted to if it needs more energy quickly, if it needs to create more DNA, and most importantly, if you need to create macrophages and anti-inflammatory energy processes. That's going to undergo in the pentose phosphate pathway. And what we're going to see a little bit later is that erythritol usage might actually be a marker for these anti-inflammatory pathways or molecules like macrophages and whatnot that would be at the sites of endothelial damage and clotting factors that would be used to repair the endothelium. So what we're going to see is that erythritol in the body might not be actually causing the blood clots, but it might actually be present at those blood clots because it might be a marker or a subsequent molecule that will induce the necessary platelets and clotting factors that will repair these endothelial damages. Upon ingestion, erythritol is poorly metabolized and mostly excreted in the urine, which is an oxymoron right off the bat, because if we're looking at ingested erythritol usage, so that's pretty much what the paper is trying to insinuate. It's that the use of erythritol in these processed foods or using these artificial sweeteners in our foods is going to cause some thrombotic event or some cardiovascular disease. However, it also notes here that upon ingestion, erythritol is poorly metabolized and mostly excreted in the urine. So how would that make sense if we're not even metabolizing it? It has no way of getting into our blood and it's mostly excreted in the urine. How does that relate to if we ingest it, it's going to increase the blood serum concentration of erythritol and then be the factor that's causing these blood clots? Doesn't really make sense. So that's a big red flag right off the bat. And scrolling down a little bit more now, right after that, early studies have implied potential benefits, including reported antioxidant potential in animal models of diabetes, noting a study here, and improvement in endothelial function after 4 weeks ingestion of erythritol-containing drinks in patients with diabetes. And again, we mentioned before that the site of all of cardiovascular diseases start as endothelial damage. So they all start at the endothelium. how is it possible that erythritol, being a marker of improvement in endothelial function after the 4-week ingestion of erythritol-containing drinks in patients with diabetes, how is an improvement of endothelial function going to lead to thrombotic events or clotting factors? Again, the same events that would induce the clotting factors to begin with. So if erythritol is there helping endothelial function, there's going to be less damage at that endothelium. Therefore, less signaling for these platelets and coagulation factors to go to that site of the endothelial damage and then create a clot or a thrombosis. Doesn't really make sense to me, but again, that's just one study. Just weary of noting that, just taking everything into account. Right after it does say, however, in a small prospective study, plasma levels of erythritol among freshman college students were associated with incident 9-month central adiposity weight gain. That's a very bold statement, especially considering that this took into account college freshmen. And what do we know in general about college freshmen? They put on the freshman 15. They're putting on weight in general. So it's a bold statement to look at erythritol levels specifically, or ingested. Actually, not even ingested. They just looked at plasma levels of erythritol and claiming that dietary erythritol then, or insinuating that dietary erythritol, things, the erythritol that you ingest, would be a marker for that central adiposity weight gain. Where, when we said before, just regular metabolism of carbohydrates is going to induce a greater plasma serum of erythritol, and coupled with the fact that we don't even digest erythritol that well in our bodies. So we can't really get it from the foods we eat into our bloodstream that well. So what's more likely the cause of the college freshman students with an increase in central adiposity weight gain? It's going to be the food that they eat, a lot of it, like the cookies and the regular carbohydrates and the overabundance of food that they're experiencing. It's going to undergo regular metabolism, right? And then that side pathway, the pentose phosphate pathway, just because there's so much energy, it doesn't need to go into glycolysis. A lot of that will get shunted over to erythritol. And then therefore your erythritol levels in your blood will go higher. But it's not due to the artificial sweetener erythritol that we're ingesting as part of like an artificial sweetener, but more so the fact that it's just from all the abundance of food that college freshmen are eating in general, right? And then in another study, erythritol levels were associated with the onset of type 2 diabetes. Now, it had mentioned before that, let's find it right here. Literally, 2 sentences above, it says that there was an improvement in endothelial function, right, while using erythritol-containing drink in patients with diabetes. And now, over here, 2 sentences later, it's associated with the onset of type 2 diabetes. Now let's break this down. Keyword here is going to be associated. And that's a very key word throughout the theme of this paper. Why? Because association is not causation, right? I can have 2 things that are associated to each other, but they're not causing each other. And that's very important to know because the study sort of masks that word. And take this for example of association. So we can have an association, a very strong association of like 99%, so 0.99 association that says the amount of white rabbits per capita in a town is associated with the amount of blue cars in that town. It's a very strong association, right? It can have an association of like near perfect, almost 1, possibly even 1. It's like they're directly associated with each other. Are the white rabbits in that town causing the amount of blue cars in that town? No. So that's what association is. It is certainly not causation. And let's think about it from this example. Erythritol levels were associated with the onset of type 2 diabetes. If you are a type 2 diabetic, any doctor is going to tell you, you need to lower your glucose intake. Why? Because we don't want to spike blood glucose, all right, or carbs or sugar, the things that come from carbs and sugar, your glucose. You don't want to spike them because your insulin is not reacting in the way that it should be at the target tissues. So you're going to have very, very high blood glucose if you keep eating carbs. What do type 2 diabetics do throughout their whole lives? They eat sugary stuff. They like sweet stuff. That's what's going to push that insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes. So what's the logical conclusion there? You're going to get artificial sweeteners that won't spike up your blood glucose, aka erythritol. So the type 2 diabetics are already going to go to erythritol just as a sugar substitute so that they can still have their sweet foods without spiking their blood glucose. So is it erythritol levels that were causing type 2 diabetes, or is it already the fact that type 2 diabetics are using erythritol on the back end because they're type 2 diabetic? Food for thought, right? A detailed examination of the relationship between erythritol and both cardiovascular disease and atherothrombotic complications has not yet been reported. All right. So this is how a lot of the results of the study were conducted, and we don't need to necessarily go through all those because they will explain it in the discussion section, and it is very, very dense. It would take us multiple hours to get through that. But nevertheless, okay, let's focus on this paragraph right here. The postprandial levels of erythritol in healthy individuals. All right, because numerous zero-calorie, keto-friendly prepared foods and beverages can possess relatively large quantities of erythritol, we thought it would be of interest to assess the physiological range of circulating erythritol levels observed following relevant dietary exposure. So, observed following a relevant dietary exposure with circulating erythritol levels. We already mentioned before that the erythritol exposure, so in the consumption of these drinks, have very little effect on the circulating erythritol levels in your blood because it cannot be metabolized well by the body. That's the whole point of using erythritol as a sugar substitute. So are these results going to directly impact each other? No, they can't. They can't directly correlate even with one another. It cannot be a cause because the ingested erythritol that you're ingesting through these foods are not going to be direct. At least you can't even measure in the way how direct that is to the erythritol levels circulating in your body. So we already discussed that. Again, this is the study that used the 8 healthy participants. So right off the bat, this is going to be a very questionable red flag study because there's only 8 patients, or 8 trials being conducted. And most studies, if you see anything that's like n equals 8, anything in the single digits is very, very low. So already very questionable. And now, essentially what they found in this very small sample size study is that the erythritol levels remained substantially elevated for over 2 days in all participants examined. Notably, the elevation in erythritol levels observed remained well above thresholds observed for concentration of erythritol that elicit significant increases in multiple incidences of platelet function, including stimulus-dependent thrombin, so one of those factors that would induce some coagulation or some blood clotting event, and increases in intracellular calcium. So what's important to note here is that while plasma levels of erythritol were low at baseline, the median, so the 25th and 75th percentile, they remained 1,000-fold higher millimolar levels for hours after the ingestion, again, over 2 days in all participants examined. And there was actually a article that I read recently that explained this quite well, or at least put this in practical terms, and it was by Dr. Peter Attia. And so moving on to his article just for a brief second, and you guys can check out this whole article. It explains it really well and how we shouldn't necessarily be running to be so worried about erythritol ingestion in our bodies. So looking at this Peter Attia article, we see that, again, he talks about how there was an 1,000 times increase in the baseline values within 30 minutes, and that these baseline levels of the clotting factors did not return to more normal levels until more than a day later. And again, it's just going back to the whole idea of that we can't really evaluate endogenous, so in our bodies, in our blood, the endogenous levels of erythritol to exogenous levels of erythritol, so the things that we ingest. It's because they're produced in our own bodies, right? So, and he says it right here, which is great. It says, how can we tell if dietary erythritol intake in particular is contributing to that MACE risk? We can't. And very important to note here, the investigators did not collect any data on erythritol intake from any of their human cohorts. So this was all taking endogenous erythritol plasma levels. So not even linking the erythritol that we ingest as being the problem, but just looking at endogenous erythritol in our own bodies that we create as being a link to clotting factors. And this is where I want to talk about specifically how the erythritol might actually be at that site of the clotting factors as a marker or as something that's positive. And there was an analogy by Dr. Ben Bickman out of BYU that explains this possibility very, very clear. And he says that if you're growing up and you don't know anything about the world and no one tells you anything better, and you walk by, you take a walk every night, and every time you walk past a house that is on fire, there's a fire truck there. And throughout your whole life, you see a few of these events, and you see every time you're walking past a fire, you're driving past a fire, there's a fire truck there. And you don't know it's a fire truck. You just see a fire and some red truck that's there. And what you do is you associate, keyword associate, you associate these two events together. And you might be led to believe that that fire truck, that red truck, is causing the fire. But that's not the case, right? The fire truck is there to put out the fire. It's there as a marker to be a positive event in that event of the fire, right? So it's an association, not a causation. So to say that erythritol is there as being a causer, or at least intending the audience to believe that erythritol is causing these thrombotic events or atherosclerosis or any sort of MACE risk, might not be actually the case. What if the erythritol is the fire truck at the event where the MACE is the fire? What if erythritol is there because of all that oxidative stress and the energy that we need for our immune system, right, as part of that pentose phosphate pathway in which erythritol is actually created in? What if it's being created because we need those factors to actually be there and repair our endothelium? And as the study noted before, erythritol was shown to increase endothelial function improvements in patients with type 2 diabetes. So again, it's a theory. It's a theory that could be studied. There is lots left to be looked at with erythritol in the blood, but this is something that could be studied quite well. We don't know that erythritol is causing these events. And just for the paper, for this article, to almost suggest that these endogenous erythritol levels are the thing that's causing an event, or at least leading it to believe that it's the event, can certainly be, honestly, almost the opposite. It might actually be there to help the events to improve that endothelial function, possibly to create more elasticity so that there's not so much wall tension on those endothelium and that there's not as much wall stress and high blood pressure at those vessels. So again, not something that's set in stone, but something that is important to think about. And scrolling down a little bit more, this paper actually does admit that erythritol is endogenously produced by the pentose phosphate pathway, metabolized, and its metabolite is readily observed in circulation. They speculate, keyword here, speculate, that erythritol levels in both validation cohorts originate from a combination of ingestion and endogenous production. The problem is that this study did not evaluate which one is which. It just speculates that because of erythritol levels that are floating in our blood, the concentration in our plasma, this is what is associated, possibly, to cardiovascular disease risk. And they did not separate or test on the ingestion of erythritol, just the endogenous plasma serum of erythritol, which, by note, in this study are way above physiological levels that will be naturally seen. So 30 grams, I forgot where this paper had said 30 grams. 30 grams of erythritol in the blood is going to be a lot different than 30 grams of erythritol that we would ingest. And so it wouldn't make sense to study 30 grams equivalent of erythritol in our bloodstream when it's not going to get digested to that amount. So this study really tested at erythritol levels that would be super physiological, something that we wouldn't really get to if we were to ingest erythritol, and that would be the main causer or association risk in cardiovascular disease. Like 30 grams endogenously would be a lot of erythritol. So scrolling down to the limitations part of this paper, I'm glad they did include this paragraph because there seems to be a lot of limitations. But what they had noted was that the measurement of erythritol in clinical cohort studies, so again, this is a cohort study, so something that they see an event, cardiovascular disease, and they look at retrospectively, right? So they already have the cardiovascular disease. They look behind that to see if there's any sort of marker that is present in all of these. They try to find some sort of association or some sort of commonality between all of the events. So it's not a clinical randomized controlled trial, which is usually the gold standard for what you would want to test for to see evaluating associations or any sort of causations. So it is a cohort study, retrospective study. It was only performed once as an overnight fasting level. So again, you just perform it once. How well can you really tell about how something's affecting the body just as one overnight fasting level? Not quite well. Whether serial measures would provide enhanced prognostic value for incident cardiovascular risk remains unknown. Because patients in our observational cohorts were recruited at quaternary referral centers and showed a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease and traditional risk factors, the translatability of our findings to the general population needs to be determined. So these were taking patients retrospectively that were already showing high prevalence, so they already have these cardiovascular disease and traditional risk factors of cardiovascular disease. So that's like saying, wow, we're testing people who have cardiovascular disease to see if there's anything which would cause cardiovascular disease. They already have it, right? So if you're just looking at erythritol and then saying, okay, well, these people now, they took erythritol and boom, now they have cardiovascular disease. They already have cardiovascular disease before that, right? So, and again, they admit the translatability of our findings to the general population needs to be determined. So if you're someone that is not showing a high prevalence or traditional risk factors, so again, your diet, smoking, alcohol, all these other traditional risk factors, and including cardiovascular disease itself, do you really have to worry about the erythritol as being something that will cause cardiovascular disease or MACE events? It would make more sense that the cardiovascular disease and traditional risk factors would be more likely to cause cardiovascular disease events, right? And again, I really appreciate that they included this, at least in one sentence, is that another limitation of our clinical observation studies is that by design, these studies can only show association and not causation. So I can't give them that much fault. They did note this. I think it's more so the general news outlets and public information outlets that would really take these findings and exacerbate them just because it's an eye-catching headline. So the study really, they probably didn't even intend for their own study to go as mainstream as it did. But I guess some more public news outlets would catch this study and sort of interpolate its findings into, at least extrapolating its findings into being something that's way more misleading than this study was intended to be. So, and again, the title of this article is The Artificial Sweetener, Erythritol, and Cardiovascular Event Risk. Just an evaluation, right? So they did not say it caused. I don't think they used the word cause at all in any of this paper, but they do note that it is merely an association that is observed, and these were observed arise from an underlying causal connection between erythritol and cardiovascular disease relevant phenotypes. So that's the study. And yeah, I really don't think that erythritol is something that we should all just be claiming to avoid. I think that erythritol would be a net positive in terms of people using sugar substitutes because I think in the long run it's going to improve your insulin resistant. You won't be as insulin resistant. The study did note that there are endothelial improvements in type 2 diabetics. So the things that we see in type 2 diabetics that would end up causing these MACE events, so like endothelial damage, these are things that would directly relate to the causing of these MACE events. So erythritol being used as a sugar substitute to limit the symptoms and the effects of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance and things of that nature, specifically with insulin, are going to be something that is a net positive as opposed to a net negative in the cardiovascular disease realm. So hopefully going through this paper, we don't have to freak out too much. It is noted by most people now, at least in the scientific space, that this study had plenty of flaws and that it's being recognized as something that we should be very wary of just telling the general public about with erythritol use. So hope this helped. Hopefully you don't have to omit any of your artificial sweetener foods just at the moment. More studies will be done. It's not to say that this can't certainly be true. If there are plenty of other studies that are clinically done, clinical randomized control trials that are done that would evaluate a direct causation between erythritol and cardiovascular disease, this would be something that I'm sure most of the scientific community would be happily ready to embrace. But as of right now, there is no need to listen to all the more mainstream popular news outlets that are exaggerating these claims based on this one study. So hope this helped, and I'll catch you in the next one.